The ferry's horn groaned, a low, mournful sound swallowed by the thick, gray air. Dean stood at the bow, the salt spray a cold kiss on his face, tasting of rust and distant storm. The island, a jagged, dark silhouette, slowly resolved itself from the encompassing fog, a place of stark rock and skeletal trees. It was exactly what he had sought. A place where the world's clamor would be muffled. A landscape as barren as his own heart felt. Solitude was not a choice. It was a necessary anesthetic. Coming here, to his estranged grandfather's inheritance, was a desperate act of self-preservation. A cartographer's attempt to map a new, empty existence. He clutched the worn leather satchel containing his grandfather's sparse will and the single, tarnished brass key. It promised nothing but isolation, and that, Dean believed, was precisely what he needed to mend. Or, perhaps, to finally break. The ferry shuddered against the barnacled pier. A solitary figure, the ferryman, pulled the heavy ropes, his face a weathered map of worry lines. He offered Dean a look that was less welcoming, more a caution. Dean ignored it, his gaze fixed on the island's interior, where the land rose steeply towards the faint, distant gleam of a lighthouse. His grandfather's cottage lay nestled at its base. The gravel crunched under his boots as he disembarked, the air immediately heavier, damp with the smell of brine and decaying seaweed. There was no one else, no cars, no other passengers. Just the ferryman, who quickly secured his vessel and retreated into its cabin, leaving Dean utterly alone on the desolate stretch of shore. A single rutted track, barely more than a goat path, snaked upwards into the mist-shrouded hills. His old pickup truck, which he'd had delivered a week prior, waited like a forgotten relic near a dilapidated shed. The road was treacherous, overgrown with hardy, salt-blasted shrubs that clawed at the paint. Further on, half hidden by a thicket of gnarled pines, he glimpsed a low, sprawling structure of gray concrete and corrugated steel. It sat silent, windowless, an imposing and deeply unsettling presence. A faded, peeling sign, barely legible through the grime, read, "Island Research Station. Unauthorized entry prohibited." The place exuded a profound stillness, as if time itself had forgotten to move within its walls. Below it, clinging to the cliff edge, was the cottage. Dean stopped the truck, killed the engine, and stepped out. The cottage was worse than he'd imagined. Weather-beaten, its paint long peeled and flaked away, it looked less like a home and more like a decaying tooth. The windows were opaque with grime and salt spray, some panes cracked like spiderwebs. It was a monument to neglect, to a life lived in isolation and then simply abandoned. Dean felt a grim satisfaction. It suited him perfectly. He pushed open the warped front door. It groaned, a long, drawn-out cry that seemed to echo through the entire structure. Dust motes danced in the anemic light filtering through the grimy windows, illuminating the shrouded furniture beneath their white sheets like ghosts waiting for a resurrection. He pulled the sheets from a small, rickety table. Beneath it lay a stack of yellowed charts, not typical nautical maps, but strange, hand-drawn grids annotated with cryptic symbols and unfamiliar coastal features. They didn't appear to be of any known landmass. His grandfather had been a cartographer, like him, but these were unlike anything he'd ever seen. They felt wrong. He moved deeper into the cottage, each step raising a puff of ancient dust, each floorboard groaning a protest. The kitchen was a disaster of rust and decay, the bedroom a jumble of moth-eaten blankets and a single unmade cot. In a small study, he found a collection of books, their spines cracked and faded, titles hinting at obscure marine biology and forgotten island folklore. On the desk, beneath a layer of dust, lay a leather-bound journal. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over its brittle cover. A soft, rhythmic scraping sound started from somewhere above him, a steady thump, Thump. It was faint, almost imperceptible, easily dismissed as the wind or the building settling. But the air was still, and the cottage, for all its decay, felt unnaturally quiet. Dean froze, straining his ears. The sound continued, a persistent, almost mechanical rhythm. He told himself it was just the house, a relic groaning under the weight of years. He walked to the window, wiped a clear patch with his sleeve, and peered out into the deepening twilight, seeing only the churning gray of the sea and the endless, encroaching fog. His boots crunched on coarse gravel as he walked toward the small stone cottage, a lone sentinel perched precariously on a promontory. It was smaller than he remembered from the old photographs, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the turbulent gray expanse. Inside, the cottage smelled of salt, damp stone, and something else. Something ancient and still, like forgotten dust motes dancing in sunbeams that never quite reached. Dean ran a hand over a grimy windowsill, a fine layer of grit coating his fingers. He had come here for solitude, for the raw, untamed quiet that only such a remote place could offer, a balm for the ragged wound of his grief. He began the methodical work of unpacking, a familiar ritual that grounded him. He cleaned, he organized, he tried to impose order on the encroaching chaos of his new surroundings, and, more importantly, his mind. But the island wouldn't allow for simple order. On his second morning, the tide, usually predictable, receded to an impossible degree. The exposed seabed seemed to pulse faintly under the bruised light of the sky, a strange, almost imperceptible tremor that vibrated through the very stones of the cottage. He dismissed it as an extreme spring tide, perhaps exacerbated by unusual atmospheric pressure, though his cartographer's mind found no ready explanation for the sheer scale of the exposure. Not clear voices, but a sibilant hiss carried on the wind, weaving through the fog that often clung to the island like a shroud. It sounded like a language, guttural and wet, just beyond the threshold of understanding. He would pause, straining his ears, convinced he'd almost grasped a word, a phrase, only for it to dissipate into the mournful shriek of the gulls or the crash of waves against the cliffs. He told himself it was the wind whistling through the old eaves, the peculiar acoustics of the rocky coast. The solitude was getting to him, he decided, playing tricks on his auditory perception. It was a natural consequence of isolation, he reasoned, a mind seeking patterns where none existed. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the persistent, almost palpable dampness that seeped into everything, Dean began sorting through the few remaining possessions his grandfather had left behind. In a forgotten sea chest, tucked beneath a mildewed wool blanket, he found it. A leather-bound journal, its cover warped and stiff with water damage. The pages within were brittle, many fused together, but others, miraculously, had survived. He opened it carefully, the scent of brine and old paper filling his nostrils. His grandfather's handwriting, usually precise and neat, was frantic in these entries, sprawling across the pages. The earliest notes detailed weather observations, tide charts, and mundane lighthouse duties. Tentacled forms, crude but undeniably menacing, writhed across margins. Eyes, vast and unblinking, stared out from the depths of the paper. There were diagrams of strange geometric patterns, symbols he didn't recognize, interspersed with fragmented, desperate warnings. "The deep song," one entry read, the ink bleeding slightly from water exposure. "It calls, not with voice, but with pull. A hunger. The water." His grandfather, a man of quiet stoicism, had never spoken of such things. What could have driven him to such frantic scribblings? Dean tried to rationalize it too. His grandfather had lived a solitary life on this rock. Perhaps the isolation had taken its toll, blurring the lines of reality in his later years. This was an old man's delusion, a descent into fantasy, nothing more. He took the journal outside, needing fresh air, needing to clear his head. He walked along the rough, uneven path that traced the island's edge, the wind whipping at his hair. Further down the coast, partially obscured by a fresh bank of fog, he saw it. A cluster of derelict buildings, their corrugated iron roofs rusted through, windows shattered like vacant eyes. This was the old research station, a place his grandfather had mentioned once or twice, long abandoned after some failed geological survey decades ago. Its skeletal remains added to the island's desolate beauty, a testament to humanity's brief, ultimately futile attempts to tame or understand this harsh land. The question hung in the air, unanswered, absorbed by the vast, indifferent gray. He clenched his jaw, determined to find a logical explanation for everything. There had to be one. There always was. What could have driven him to such frantic scribblings? Dean tried to rationalize the words, to dismiss them as the ramblings of an old man succumbing to isolation. But the chilling certainty in the scrawled ink clung to him like the island's persistent fog. His determination, a stubborn current beneath his grief, pulled him from the cottage the next morning. The wind, sharp and tasting of brine, whipped at his coat as he navigated the uneven track away from the lighthouse. He knew of the small research station on the island's northern tip, a place where marine biologists occasionally studied the local ecosystem. Perhaps they held old records, maps, anything that might shed light on his grandfather's descent into such terrifying convictions. The research station was a squat, utilitarian building of weathered concrete, hunkered against the elements. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of ozone and dust, a stark contrast to the damp, earthy scent of the cottage. A lone researcher, a woman with spectacles perched on her nose and a pile of salinity reports before her, looked up from a desk cluttered with instruments. Dean explained his purpose, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet space. He sought historical records, old charts, local folklore, anything concerning the island's deeper past. The researcher, initially wary, eventually pointed him to a section of shelves lined with brittle, yellowed tomes and binders. Most of it's just weather patterns and fishing logs. She said, her voice dry, "But there are some local histories, if you're interested in old wives' tales." He spent the better part of the day hunched over ancient texts, his fingers leaving faint smudges on the dusty pages. He read of their reverence for the deep, their fear of what lay beneath the waves. Gradually, patterns began to emerge. Scattered mentions of a sunken city just beyond the island's treacherous reefs, a place of cyclopean architecture swallowed by the ocean millennia ago. One particularly faded drawing depicted figures in ceremonial garb, their arms outstretched towards a swirling vortex in the sea, beneath a moon that seemed to bleed light. Dean's stomach tightened. These weren't just old wives' tales. They echoed the frantic warnings in his grandfather's journal. One entry, titled "The Bargain of the Deep," spoke of a desperate pact made by the islanders during a time of famine and endless storms. They had sought salvation from the dweller below, and it had granted them respite, but at a terrible price. The details were vague, shrouded in metaphor and fear, but the essence was clear. A promise of perpetual tribute, a cyclical return, a pact. The word resonated with a terrible clarity, a direct echo of his grandfather's barely legible scrawls. He copied down every relevant passage, his hand trembling slightly as he did. The journey back to the cottage was a blur of wind and gathering gloom. The island, once a symbol of escape, now felt like a cage, its rocky shores merely a prelude to the vast, unknowable depths surrounding it. He returned to the journal, the weight of the old texts pressing on him. With the context of the research station findings, the fragmented entries began to coalesce into a horrifying narrative. The pact. It awakens. The tide brings the debt. His grandfather hadn't been delusional. He had been desperately trying to warn someone. Sleep, when it finally came, was not a refuge. He was beneath the waves, the pressure immense, crushing. Indistinct shapes, vast and ancient, drifted past him, their forms dissolving into the murky depths before he could truly grasp them. He awoke with a gasp, his body slick with sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs. He pushed himself upright, his vision blurry, his mind still half submerged in the nightmare. As his eyes adjusted to the dim pre-dawn light filtering through the window, he noticed it. On the damp stone wall beside his bed, where the plaster had long since crumbled away, a patch of something alien pulsed with a soft, ethereal luminescence. It was a cluster of algae, impossibly vibrant, glowing with an unnatural internal light that shifted from deep emerald to an unsettling icy blue. Its tendrils seemed to spread slowly, deliberately, across the rough stone, as if reaching, stretching. It shouldn't have been there, not inside, not like this. The air around it felt strangely heavy, moist, carrying a faint, sweet sick smell like stagnant seawater in decay. It had found its way in. It was already here. The ancient texts lay open, their brittle pages a map of forgotten fears. Dean's fingers, still smudged with the dust of centuries, traced the crude pictograms of the island's original inhabitants. Figures with elongated limbs, heads bowed in supplication to a vast, churning ocean. He read of their reverence for the deep, their terror of what lay beneath, a primal fear that resonated with an unsettling clarity in the quiet cottage. He'd spent the better part of the day hunched over these accounts, seeking patterns, seeking answers. But all he found was a deepening chill that had nothing to do with the sea air. He pushed a heavy volume aside, its worn leather groaning softly. He'd just placed it carefully on the small, cluttered table beside the oil lamp, the flame flickering a weak orange against the encroaching dusk. He turned to stretch his stiff back, the muscles protesting, and when he looked back, the book was no longer there. His gaze swept the table, then the floor. It lay by the hearth, a good 6 feet away, its spine splayed, pages crumpled as if someone had flung it in frustration. Dean blinked, a slow, disbelieving act. He hadn't touched it. No window was open. The cottage was utterly still. A prickle of unease crawled up his neck, tighter than the knot in his shoulders. He walked over, picked up the book, and placed it back on the table with a deliberate firmness, his breath held. A low, resonant hum began then. It wasn't a sound that came from the wind or the waves. It seemed to emanate from the very timbers of the cottage. A deep, pervasive vibration that settled in his bones. It was a sound without origin. A subtle thrumming that made the air feel thick, almost viscous. He pressed his palms to his ears, but it wasn't external. It was inside him, a frequency that made his teeth ache. He felt a dizzying pressure behind his eyes, a strange disassociation from his surroundings. For a fleeting, horrifying instant, his face wasn't his own. His features stretched, elongated, his eyes wide and black, like bottomless pools. The skin seemed to ripple, an aqueous distortion, before snapping back to his familiar, tired visage. He recoiled, a choked gasp escaping him. He stared at the glass, his own face staring back, pale and shaken. Had he imagined it? The hum intensified, a silent scream that vibrated in his chest. Driven by a desperate need for clarity, Dean moved to his grandfather's desk, a heavy oak monstrosity cluttered with navigational tools and faded charts. He pulled open a drawer that had always stuck, surprised when it slid free with unusual ease. Inside, tucked beneath a stack of tide tables, he found a small, leather-bound journal. Not records of weather or shipping, but frantic, repetitive entries. Symbols, painstakingly drawn, accompanied by fragmented notes about the deep hunger and the old pact. One entry, dated weeks before his grandfather's disappearance, stood out. The offering must be made, not to appease, but to delay, to ward off the pull. The station holds the key. The research station. Dean remembered the faint outline on one of the larger island maps. A small structure marked simply Research Station on the far side of the island, nestled near a rocky inlet. He'd never thought much of it, assuming it was a defunct weather post. His grandfather trying to ward something off? Sacrificing to it? He grabbed a lantern, its glass rattling faintly with the pervasive hum, and set out. The fog had thickened, swallowing the path, muffling the roar of the waves into a distant sigh. Each step was a plunge into the unknown, the beam of his lantern cutting a narrow, shifting tunnel through the milky shroud. The hum, already a part of him, seemed to pulse with a greater intensity, making his head throb. He forced open the warped metal door, a shriek of tortured hinges echoing into the fog. Desks were overturned, equipment smashed. He shone his lantern beam around, illuminating rusted machinery, shattered glass. The hum vibrated through the very floor beneath his feet, rising to a near-deafening crescendo in his mind. It had no discernible shape, no eyes, no limbs, yet it flowed with a predatory grace, expanding, contracting, coalescing into something vast and formless. It stretched towards him, a tendril of pure, inky blackness reaching across the dusty floor. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. He didn't wait to see if it followed, didn't dare look back. It was reaching. The faint outline of the research station still prickled at Dean's memory. A cold, insistent thought. He had seen it on his grandfather's largest island map, a small, unassuming square on the far side, near a craggy inlet. It suggested a purpose beyond a mere weather post. Dean pushed the thought aside for a moment, his determination hardening. The answers, he felt, lay in the journal. He sat at the rough-hewn table, the journal open before him, its brittle pages exuding the scent of aged paper and something else, something saline and faintly metallic. His fingers traced the spidery script, deciphering the increasingly frantic entries from his grandfather. The early passages were indeed observations, detailed notations on the tides, the currents, the strange bioluminescence sometimes seen far out at sea. But as he turned the pages, the tone shifted. The hum grows louder, not sound precisely, more like a pressure, an insistence against the inner ear. It seeks purchase, must reinforce the wards. Wards? Dean frowned, rereading the line. He flipped back, finding earlier mentions of symbols carved into the lighthouse's foundation stones, of strange poultices made from local herbs and deep-sea kelp, left at the water's edge during specific lunar phases. This wasn't observation. This was active intervention. His grandfather hadn't merely been documenting a phenomenon. He had been engaged in a desperate, solitary battle. A low thrum began in the very bones of the cottage, not the familiar creak of old wood in the wind, but a deeper resonance, like a vast, submerged bell tolling in slow motion. Dean felt it in his teeth, a vibration that threatened to loosen them from their sockets. He pressed his palms against his ears, but the sound was internal, a rising pressure behind his eyes. The deep song. His grandfather had written about it, described it as a siren call for the mind, a melody designed to unmoor reality. He forced himself to focus on the journal again, his eyes blurring slightly. The words on the page seemed to swim, the ink appearing to darken and lighten with the rhythm of the thrumming. It demands recognition. It demands return. The pact, broken by the old ones, now falls to me. The veil thins. The song will claim those who listen too long. The ritual must be precise. The offering must be pure. To keep it dormant, to keep it from rising. An offering. A ritual. His grandfather hadn't just been a lonely keeper of the light. He had been a guardian, a warder against something ancient and hungry. The clarity of this realization was horrifying. And now, his grandfather was gone. The lighthouse was Dean's. The responsibility, the failing ritual, the encroaching entity. It was all his now. The hum intensified, no longer a thrum, but a sustained, dissonant chord that clawed at the edges of his sanity. Was it truly there, or was the deep song already twisting his perceptions? He clutched the journal, his knuckles white. He had to know more. His gaze fell upon a later entry, scrawled with a desperate urgency. The lower chamber, below the light, it holds the key, the true heart of the old binding. If the song grows too strong, if Dean fail, seek the chamber. The sigil of the coil will show the way. The lower chamber. Dean's eyes darted around the sparse living area, then to the winding staircase that led up to the lantern room. Below the light? Yes, but where? He remembered the thick, damp stone of the lighthouse's base, the way it felt impossibly solid. The floorboards beneath his feet felt like shifting sand. The walls seemed to breathe. He moved with a newfound purpose, his gaze sweeping over the ancient stone. He ran his hands along the rough-hewn blocks, feeling for any irregularity, any seam. His fingers, guided by an instinct that felt both alien and innate, brushed against a faint, almost invisible carving. A sigil. A coil, indeed, like a serpent or an unraveling spiral etched into the stone itself. He pressed against the section, feeling a slight give. With a grunt, he pushed harder, and a narrow seam appeared. He braced himself, inserting his fingers into the gap, and pulled. The stone slab, heavy and groaning, swung inward with a low, grating sound, revealing an aperture of absolute blackness. The stench from within was overpowering now, a primordial stink of decay and stagnant water, laced with something metallic and utterly alien. He had found it. The damp, salt-laced air of the lighthouse's base pressed in on Dean, thick and cold. His fingers, numb from the insistent chill, traced the rough-hewn stones that formed the circular wall. He remembered the feeling of impossible solidity, the way the structure felt rooted not just to the island, but to something far deeper. His gaze, narrowed and sharp, scanned every joint, every fissure, searching for what he intuitively knew lay hidden. Below the light, yes, but where? It yielded slightly to his touch, a barely perceptible give. He pressed harder, a groan of ancient stone echoing faintly, then again, his shoulder leaning into the damp rock. A thin vertical seam, almost invisible against the weathered surface, slowly widened. A sliver of deeper, absolute blackness appeared. He braced himself, pushing with all his might. The stone grated, a sound like a giant's teeth grinding, and a section of the wall, perhaps 4 feet wide and 7 high, swung inward with a heavy, deliberate sigh. Dean fumbled for his lantern, its beam cutting a trembling swathe through the gloom. The passage was not natural rock. Its walls were smooth, cut stone, leading down a flight of uneven steps. The passage opened into a larger space, a subterranean chamber carved deep beneath the lighthouse. This was it. This was the research station. It was not what he expected. Not a sterile lab, but a forgotten, decaying space, clearly abandoned for decades. Heavy, salt-pitted metal tables stood scattered, covered in a fine layer of greenish dust. Rusting instruments, unrecognizable in their function, lay strewn across a workbench. Charts, brittle with age, depicting complex swirling patterns and indecipherable symbols, were tacked to a corkboard, curling at the edges like ancient parchment. A single high-backed chair, its leather rotting, sat before one of the tables, facing a central feature that dominated the room. In the center of the research station, set into a circular depression in the floor, was a basin of obsidian black stone. It was not a pool of water, not exactly. It was a perfectly still, utterly opaque surface, reflecting no light, absorbing everything. Yet, from its depths, a faint internal luminescence pulsed. A sickly cerulean glow, like deep-sea bioluminescence, throbbed within the blackness, expanding and contracting with a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the beat of his own heart. The surface of the black basin began to ripple, not from disturbance, but from within. The cerulean glow intensified, blooming into intricate shifting patterns that defied geometry. Shapes that seemed to fold in on themselves, forms that were simultaneously solid and fluid, began to writhe beneath the surface. It was not water, not liquid at all, but a window. His mind reeled, struggling to comprehend the impossible sight. This was no ordinary deep-sea phenomenon. This was a gateway, a membrane between worlds. And through it, he saw. The vision struck him with the force of a physical blow, a torrent of images and sensations that bypassed his eyes and flooded his consciousness. He saw not with his sight, but with a deeper, more primal part of his being. He saw the very rock of the island dissolving, becoming part of the vast, ancient entity that pulsed beneath the waves. Then the vision narrowed, focusing with terrifying clarity on himself. He stumbled back, gasping, a choked cry tearing from his throat. The pulsing light in the obsidian basin seemed to mock him, the ripples on its surface now more agitated, as if the entity had acknowledged his presence, had seen him in turn. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of something primordial and predatory. It was immediate, personal, and absolute. The entity was not merely stirring, it was reaching, and it had found him. Now, that solidity felt like a cage. A low hum vibrated through the stones, a sound that wasn't quite a sound, more a pressure against his eardrums, a reverberation deep within his chest. It swelled, then receded, like a slow, monstrous breath. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence, a cloying sweetness that made his stomach churn. He tasted brine and something metallic, a taste like old blood on his tongue, though his mouth was dry. His own thoughts felt sluggish, distant, as if wading through murky water. Give in. His hands, still resting on the rough stone, suddenly felt alien, heavy, as though they no longer belonged to him. A strange, compelling urge to press harder, to grind his skin against the abrasive surface, pulsed through his veins. He fought it, clenching his fists, forcing his mind to reassert control. This wasn't just an external threat. It was trying to dismantle him from within. He was trapped. The entity wasn't just circling. It was actively trying to breach the last fortifications of his mind, to claim him. His grandfather's journal. He stumbled back from the wall, tripping over a loose stone, his breath catching in ragged gasps. His eyes darted around the confined space, searching. He'd dropped it earlier, in his panic. There, beneath a coil of rope, its leather cover half hidden in the gloom. He snatched it up, his numb fingers fumbling with the clasp. The brittle pages crackled as he tore through them, ignoring the earlier frantic entries about the island's geography and the strange currents. He needed answers, not observations. His gaze skimmed over diagrams of constellations he didn't recognize. Archaic symbols etched with painstaking precision, and dense, cryptic prose. The grandfather's handwriting, usually so meticulous, grew increasingly jagged, desperate, reflecting a mind under siege. Beneath it, a crudely drawn map, not of the island itself, but of an interior space. A series of interconnected chambers, leading to a central circular room. His grandfather must have known about it, perhaps even used it. The portal cannot be fully closed, only sealed. The entity seeks purchase through the deepest channels of sorrow, of loss. A sacrifice. What kind of sacrifice? The next lines were blurred, smudged as if by a trembling hand. He could make out fragments, not of life, of essence, a fragment of self, willingly offered, to become the anchor, the vessel. And then, clearer, stark words that seemed to leap from the page and coil around his throat. One's deepest, most cherished memory, the very core of one's identity, erased. To forget completely, to become nothing. To forget. to sacrifice the very memories that defined him, that connected him to his lost family, to the life he desperately tried to outrun but still clung to become an empty vessel, a blank slate. It was a death of a different kind, perhaps worse than any physical demise. The entity wanted to consume his sorrow. This ritual demanded he willingly surrender the source of it, and everything else besides. It was a choice between annihilation by a monstrous force or self-annihilation by his own hand, a calculated erasure of who he was. It is easier. He felt the tendrils of the entity seeking to exploit his moment of weakness, his horror at the journal's revelation. But then, a flicker of defiance ignited within him. Easier? No. If he was to be erased, it would be on his terms, to protect whatever was left of the world from this encroaching horror. He wouldn't let it win. His gaze, now hardened with a terrible resolve, fell back to the crude map. The research station. That was where the final horrifying act would play out. He would face this. He would make the sacrifice. He would go to the research station. The wind shrieked. It was no longer the mournful howl Dean had grown accustomed to, but a raw, tearing sound, as if the very fabric of the air was being rent apart. Outside the cottage, the world had become a churning, indistinct gray, a maelstrom of fog and rain that lashed against the thick glass of the lantern room. The light, usually a steadfast beacon, seemed to falter, its beam swallowed almost immediately by the encroaching chaos. He could hear the ocean's roar, not as waves breaking, but as a deep, guttural growl, a sound of immense, unfathomable hunger rising from the depths. The island itself was undergoing a grotesque transformation. What had been familiar became subtly, terrifyingly wrong. The gnarled branches of the stunted trees, already twisted by years of sea wind, now writhed as if in agony, their bark weeping a dark, sticky sap that smelled of brine and something profoundly metallic. Patches of lichen on the rocks pulsed with a faint, sickly luminescence, like diseased flesh. The ground beneath his boots felt spongy, yielding, as if the earth itself was softening, decaying from within. Dean had seen the changes creeping, a slow corruption, but now it was an onslaught, a fever dream made real, the island succumbing to the entity's burgeoning power. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones, a terror that went beyond fear for his life, touching the core of his very being. The creature was no longer merely stirring. It was awake, enraged, and reaching. He clutched the journal, its worn leather a slim comfort against the escalating madness. The final entries scrawled in his grandfather's frantic hand detailed the counter-ritual. It was a desperate, archaic measure, a pact of sacrifice to appease or perhaps re-imprison the thing that had lain dormant for so long. His memories. To forget his family, his past, the very essence of what had made him Dean. To become an empty vessel, a blank slate, adrift in the present. He had come here seeking solitude, a fresh start, an escape from the unbearable weight of his loss. Now the island demanded a different kind of erasure. He thought of the scent of his wife's hair, the sound of his daughter's laughter. These were the ghosts that haunted him, the wounds that refused to heal. To willingly relinquish them. It was a horror beyond comprehension. But the alternative, the thought of the entity's full awakening, of this creeping horror consuming everything, was worse. His resolve, born of desperation and a profound, reluctant sense of duty, solidified. He moved through the cottage, gathering the few items his grandfather had listed. A specific type of dried kelp, a smooth, obsidian-like stone he'd found tucked away in a dusty drawer, and a small, tarnished silver compass. It was the entity, pressing in, its psychic tendrils probing, testing, demanding. His destination was the research station, an isolated derelict structure on the far side of the island, a place his grandfather had rarely spoken of. It was where the original pact had been made, where the boundary between worlds was thinnest. The journey would be treacherous. As he pushed open the heavy oak door, the elements slammed into him with physical force, stealing his breath. Rain, driven by the gale, felt like icy needles, and the fog was a living, swirling wall that pressed against him, trying to force his back. He lowered his head, gripping the journal and the small pouch of ritual items, and began to walk. The path, once faint, was now almost entirely obscured. Each step was a battle against the wind, against the rising tide of unnaturalness. He could hear things in the fog, sounds that weren't gulls or breaking waves. A low, resonant thrumming, like a colossal heart beating beneath the earth. He pressed on, his vision limited to a few feet ahead, the lighthouse a fading memory behind him. It was a low, squat building of gray concrete and rusted metal, its windows long since shattered, gaping like empty eye sockets. A sign, half torn from its moorings, clattered violently in the wind, its faded lettering illegible. Inside, the air was stagnant, heavy with the smell of decay, salt, and something else, something sharp and acrid, like old ozone. Rusting scientific equipment lay scattered across the floor, half buried under drifts of sand and seaweed. Broken glass crunched under his boots. The wind screamed through the broken windows, but inside, the resonant hum was louder, more pervasive, vibrating in his chest, making his teeth ache. This was it. The crucible. The compass, when he placed it down, spun wildly, then pointed not north, but straight down into the concrete floor. The air crackled around him, the hum intensifying into a low thrum that vibrated through his very bones. Dean looked at the journal, then at the obsidian stone, then at the empty, swirling chaos outside the broken windows. He knew the cost. He knew the ritual. And for the first time since he'd set foot on this accursed island, he was ready to pay. The wind shrieked. Dean stood in the doorway, the heavy oilskin coat clinging to his frame, the ancient salt-encrusted lantern clutched in one hand. In his other, a small, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with his grandfather's desperate looping script, and a chipped ceramic bowl, heavy with the mixture of iron filings and dried kelp he'd painstakingly prepared. He stepped out, the door slamming shut behind him with a final, echoing thud. There was no turning back. The path to the lighthouse was a gauntlet. The very air was thick, not just with moisture, but with a palpable, vibrating pressure that pressed in on his eardrums. Every gust of wind was a physical blow, threatening to rip the lantern from his grasp. The ground beneath his boots was slick with algae in the ceaseless rain, each step a deliberate, precarious act. He could taste salt and something else. A metallic tang, like old blood mixed with ozone, clinging to the back of his throat. The light from his lantern struggled, swallowed by the oppressive gloom that clung to the island like a shroud. Dean pushed forward, his focus narrowed to the faint, pulsing beacon of the lighthouse, a distant dying eye in the storm. He reached the base of the lighthouse, the colossal stone structure looming over him, a monument to defiance against the churning sea. But it wasn't just the tower. Attached to its ancient foundations, half buried into the cliff face, was a low, squat building he'd only ever seen from a distance. The old research station. Its windows, dark and vacant, seemed to watch him. This was where his grandfather had conducted his grim studies, where the true nature of the entity and the pact had been explored. The heavy, rusted door to the research station groaned open on hinges that shrieked like dying gulls, revealing an interior steeped in perpetual twilight. The air inside was still and heavy, carrying the scent of decay, brine, and something indefinably wrong. He moved deeper, his boots crunching on scattered debris, each sound amplified in the suffocating quiet. Not from any discernible source, but from within the very fabric of the air, a chorus of sibilant sounds that brushed against the edges of his sanity. He saw it then, not with his eyes, but with a terrifying clarity in his mind. The true, unvarnished visage of his profound personal tragedy. The face of his beloved, twisted into an expression of unimaginable agony, accusing him, blaming him. He stumbled, a strangled gasp catching in his throat, the ceramic bowl almost slipping from his grasp. This was the entity's touch, not physical, but a corrosive invasion of his deepest wounds. He fought back, clenching his jaw, forcing his gaze to the center of the room, where a circular pattern, etched into the flagstones, glowed faintly with an internal, sickly luminescence. His grandfather's notes had described it, the focal point. Dean dropped to his knees, his hands trembling but resolute. He opened the journal, his eyes scanning the familiar frantic diagrams. The entity was fully here now, a crushing weight in the air, a pressure that threatened to collapse his very bones. The glass jars on the shelves rattled, the specimens within them seeming to writhe. He began the ritual, sprinkling the iron filings and kelp mixture into the center of the glowing circle. His voice, hoarse and strained, reciting the guttural words from the journal. Each syllable felt like tearing something vital from his own throat. The light from the circle intensified, throbbing like a bruised heart. The pact wasn't just about sealing, it was about sustenance. The entity didn't merely want to be free, it wanted to consume. And the sacrifice, he now understood with a gut-wrenching certainty, was not just the material placed in the circle, but the one who offered it. His grandfather hadn't just sealed the entity. He had bound himself to it, a perpetual guardian, a living anchor. Dean felt the entity probing, seeking a purchase within him, a place to sink its tendrils. It wasn't trying to kill him. It was trying to claim him. He looked down at the glowing circle, at the symbols that pulsed with a terrible energy. With a sudden, desperate clarity, he understood. It was the only way. He plunged his hand into the center of the glowing mixture, a searing agony blossoming through his palm, up his arm, and into his chest. He cried out, a raw, primal sound that was swallowed by the roaring storm and the entity's triumphant shriek. The light from the circle flared, blinding him, and he felt something tear within him. Not flesh, but something deeper, something intrinsically connected to his very essence. The pressure in the air eased, the walls of the research station settled, the specimens in the jars grew still. The portal was sealed. He had paid the price. He was no longer just Dean, the cartographer. He was the guardian, eternally bound to the churning depths, a living sacrifice. The wind shrieked. He stood in the center of the main room, a single lantern casting a trembling circle of light that fought against the encroaching shadows. The air itself felt thick, vibrating with an unnatural resonance. A low, guttural thrum that was no longer just in his mind, but seemed to emanate from the very floorboards beneath his feet. The deep song. It was here. He clutched the heavy, leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age, the last testament of his grandfather. The old man hadn't just kept the light. He had kept the silence. The lighthouse wasn't merely a beacon for ships. It was a tuning fork, designed to resonate at a frequency that kept the abyssal entity dormant, a lullaby whispered into the deep. But his grandfather had failed, the journal revealed, his will weakening, his mind succumbing to the insistent hum, allowing the creature's song to seep through the cracks. Dean understood now. The mapping, the charting, the lines and contours of his own trade. They were all attempts to impose order on chaos, to define what was indefinable. But this wasn't about defining. It was about disrupting. His gaze fell upon the intricate hand-drawn chart on the table, a map of the island he had meticulously recreated from his grandfather's notes and his own obsessive observations. It wasn't just topography. It depicted ley lines, currents of unseen energy, points of convergence that hummed with the deep song. One central point, marked with a crude, ancient symbol, pulsed on the paper, mirroring the throbbing in his own temples. It was directly beneath the lighthouse, a chamber his grandfather had hinted at in his ravings. A shudder ran through the cottage, a deep, resonant tremor that rattled the shelves and sent dust motes dancing in the lantern light. The deep song intensified, a chorus of unseen voices rising from beneath the floor, a siren call promising oblivion and understanding. But the image of his grandfather's vacant eyes, the finality of his descent into madness, spurred him on. He wouldn't become another echo in the deep. He had to sever the connection, break the rhythm. The journal spoke of a specific ritual, not of sacrifice, but of reorientation. A precise sequence of actions tied to the island's unique geology and the lighthouse's ancient mechanism could momentarily disrupt the entity's hold, forcing it back into its slumber. It was a temporary measure, a reprieve, not a victory, and it came at a cost. The deep song here was deafening, a physical pressure against his chest, vibrating through his bones. He found the focal point, a rough-hewn stone altar carved with the same symbols from his grandfather's map. He placed a specially prepared piece of polished obsidian, charged with his own focused intent, onto a particular indentation on the altar. Then, with a grunt, he pulled a heavy lever, rusted but still functional, that his grandfather had meticulously described. A low, grinding groan filled the chamber, followed by a high-pitched whine that cut through the deep song like a knife. The entire structure of the lighthouse vibrated violently, the stones themselves screaming. Dean felt a searing pain behind his eyes, a sensation of his very thoughts being stretched thin, then snapped. He gasped, falling to his knees, his mind threatening to unravel. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the overwhelming pressure receded. The deep song was gone, or at least muted. Dean lay there, gasping, the taste of brine and ash in his mouth. He had done it. Days later, or perhaps weeks' time, had become a shifting, unreliable thing. Dean found himself on a small vessel, the rocking motion a gentle counterpoint to the persistent hum that now resonated within his own skull. He was alone on the deck, wrapped in a coarse blanket, staring out at the endless expanse of water. The crew, a burly fisherman and his quiet apprentice, treated him with a cautious deference, their eyes darting away from his own. The journey ended at a bleak, utilitarian pier, its concrete scarred by years of relentless sea spray. Dean was led, not unwillingly, to a building that squatted low against the horizon, the research station. Its walls were stark, windowless, offering no glimpse of the sea it faced. Inside, the air was sterile, smelling of disinfectant and stale paper. A few individuals moved through the corridors, their faces obscured by the dim lighting, their movements efficient, watchful. They spoke in hushed tones, their words indistinguishable, like the distant murmur of waves. Dean was taken to a sparse room, a cot, a metal table, a single chair. No windows. He sat on the cot, his gaze fixed on the bare wall. He understood now. He had paid the cost. He was free of the island, yes, but the island, and what lay beneath it, was now irrevocably a part of him. He was listening, always listening.